we're going to shift to talking about practices.
The stories.
Okay. Remember the kind of rubric or pattern that Jesus describes for effective growth is we have to make sense of certain ideas. So we focused on the key idea, which is the Father and the kingdom, the Father's kingdom. We'll add other ideas to that as we go through our time together over the course of all of these retreats, but that's the key idea that we are doing for this one. And then now what we're going to do is we're going to focus on Jesus' account of how the disciplines work. Okay? And just start by kind of asking a question that was a common question in the ancient world, and it's worth asking still today. Okay? And that is, how do you know when you're interacting with somebody who is a true lover of wisdom? Somebody who is authentic in their endeavor to come to understand things and to live well, rather than just somebody who really likes talking about that kind of stuff, right? And maybe somebody who likes talking about that stuff because he's figured out how to kind of trick people out of cash by doing it or something like that, right? So in the ancient world, you have this common observation that it's sometimes hard to tell the difference between the philosopher and the charlatan, the trickster, okay? Because they can come in and they use the same language and they'll quote the same people and all of that. And on the front end, it's sometimes hard to tell the difference. And the answer that they came up with, which is a pretty good answer, is that it actually all turns on this thing that they call askesis, which we usually translate today in English as spiritual exercise. It's just the general word for training, actually, okay? For exercise training. And the idea there is that the person who is the real lover of wisdom is the person who is trying, well, who isn't just trying at the moment, but he's approaching each day as an opportunity to train, to become the kind of person who would do what is right and say what is true. And there's a distinction there that's important, okay? And it's the distinction between trying and training. Because there are a lot of things in life that you cannot do just by trying. Okay? And so, how many of you could go out this moment and flat out run a marathon? No? Well, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. If you tried really, really hard, how many of you could flat out run a marathon?
Probably
okay. A few maybe, but really for most of us, trying really hard wouldn't make the difference in that, because we would hit the edge of just what is possible. And we would, our trying would be failing. Okay. But there's a different question if you kind of think about it this way. How many of you could take on a practice that over time brought you to a place where you could run for that long? Well, now that's probably most of us at least, okay? And maybe all of us, right? I'm not very good at cardio, so training is something different. And so, and the true lover of wisdom, the person who's really seeking to live well, is the person that approaches life as an occasion for training for wisdom, training for this life before God. Okay? Now, so if you think of kind of two categories, we talk about spiritual exercise, and that's kind of this this broad notion of approaching life as training with the goal not just of doing the right thing, but of becoming the sort of person for whom doing the right thing would just be the automatic response. Right? Now, how do you approach a whole life that way? To do that, you move from kind of the big picture, or the kind of the overarching category would be spiritual exercise. What you would take on would be a set of disciplines. Like, there's a lot of different disciplines that would be an aspect of this life of spiritual exercise. Okay, and so let me just say a word about what is a discipline. I've given you a definition there, but a discipline is a set of regular actions that are within my power right now. There's something I can do today, okay? But that over time will lead me to a place where I can eventually do something that I cannot do today by effort alone, okay? It's a set of actions that brings me to a place where I can do something that now I cannot do by effort alone, okay? So, and it turns out that Jesus has a very clear, insightful, and coherent account of how the disciplines work. He not only uses disciplines himself. Okay, you read through the Gospels and it's pretty clear he's doing that. But he also he teaches his students to use disciplines. Okay, and that's important. Now, it would also be possible, though, to use disciplines and even tell others to use disciplines without having a very clear understanding of how or why they work. Right? But Jesus has that kind of additional something there. He can explain why they work, and he does. There's two passages that he does this in primarily, some other kind of secondary passages. But we'll look at Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 18, though we'll skip the middle part on the which is the Lord's Prayer. And then we'll look at Matthew 25, verses 1 through 13. Before we look into his account in those passages that give us kind of why they work, let's kind of talk a little bit about some of the particular disciplines that we see in the Gospels. Okay? When you think about Jesus and his kind of pattern of life, there's a few things that stand out, right? One of those is the way in which he routinely draws away from crowds. Right? He's in crowds a lot, but he also routinely pulls out away from them, and he finds lonely places. Right? He goes into solitude. Not only does he go into solitude, but we find him, for instance, in Mark chapter 6, after he sent his students out on this kind of, training expedition, we could say. And when they come back, they've been working so hard, it says they don't even have time to eat and so forth. And he says, that's great, now come away, let's find a lonely place. You need to have some solitude. So we find not only that he does it himself, but that he teaches his students to do this as well. Okay? In Matthew chapter 6, we find him giving specific teachings about how to give help to other people in secret, how to pray, and how to fast. Right? So these are disciplines that we see him doing and teaching his students to do. We find really, I think, a kind of discipline even in the way of doing meals together. And so a lot of these are things that are in standard lists of spiritual disciplines. Okay, a lot of people have noticed this. There's some others in there that I have not seen show up on lists, but are important to notice. I'll point one out. For instance, in Luke 11, or is it 10? It's 10, I believe. In Luke 10, Jesus sends out this second group of students. Yeah. He first sends out, in chapter 9, he sends out the 12, and these are ones that are real close to him. And then in chapter 10, he sends out the 70, 72. Okay? And it's interesting when he sends them out, we'll loop back to them later in this series, but I'll just tell you now, the 70-72, the reason for the number, the significance of that, is it's the table of nations. This is Jesus's core for world mission. The 12 are going to be the nucleus of a renewed Israel, right? They're going to sit on 12 thrones judging the 12 tribes and so forth. He talked about that. What are the 70-72 for? They're the ones he's training to send to the nations, okay? And that's not often recognized, but I'll give you the argument later, or if you want. But anyhow, now when he does this, so he sends them out on this kind of expedition. It's a bounded exercise, and it's interesting when he sends them out. He tells them, he says, "You're going to go to villages." He says, "Don't take any money. Don't take extra clothes or food." And interestingly, don't talk to anybody on the road. What is this? This is him arranging. In Luke 11, he sends them out, and he's arranging for this intentional vulnerability where they have to show up in a village, and they're going to be dependent on what God has arranged before they got there. They're gonna receive hospitality, but and I think the reason he says don't greet anybody on the road is not like, hey guys, you need to learn how to be rude. It's rather, I don't know about you, but if I was traveling to the next village without any resources and would be dependent upon whatever hospitality I was going to receive there, what would I be doing with everybody on the road? I would be trying to set up where I'm staying that night. And Jesus says, don't do that. Okay? Not for this exercise. Now, how do I know it's an exercise? Because you get later in the gospel, chapter 22, and he says, now when I sent you out, did you lack anything? No, didn't lack anything. He says, good, remember that. But now, take extra money. If you have 2 jackets, sell one of them, take a sword, because you're going to need some help, right? So I mean, he kind of changes. He gives different instructions for ongoing mission. This kind of radical vulnerability and dependence is not a forever strategy, as it were, for mission, but it's an important experience to have in order to be able to co-work with God as you go to the nations. Okay? They're going to have that experience of knowing God was there before they got there. They didn't arrange anything, but they were taken care of. Okay? And so that's a discipline as well. All right? There's a lot of disciplines that we have in the Gospels, and we'll spend some time kind of looking at separate ones, and we'll have sessions on that in later retreats. But what we want to do in this one is to focus on Jesus' account of how these disciplines work, okay? Because that also tells us some ways that they can be twisted so they don't do what they were designed for, okay? So it's important to know how they work to be able to use them well. So we get this kind of big picture account of the disciplines and how they work, beginning in chapter 6 of Matthew. And he gives us 2 accounts. The first is what I call a top-down account. In other words, it focuses on how these disciplines, things like prayer and fasting and intentional vulnerability and solitude and silence, how these practices change us, that focuses on the transition from conscious, intentional action, how that transitions down to kind of soul level, unconscious, habitual action. Okay? And so it's a top down. It moves from our intention, our focus, down to what happens when we're not focusing. Okay? Now he gives a second account in Matthew 25, and we'll look at that in a little bit, next session, that's a bottom up, that essentially focuses on the result, on how important it is that the things that happen in these disciplines get down to that level of habit, where they will happen even when we're not choosing anymore. Okay? And so we'll look at that in the next session. But this one, it's a top-down. And we're going to read it. Before we read it, I just want to point something out, okay? And that is that there is a pattern. He goes through 3 different acts of righteousness, is probably how it's translated in your translation. I like to translate it as acts of right living, okay? But he focuses on 3 of them. You have first the giving of help, or mercies, right? Charitable aid, and then prayer and then fasting, right? In the order. But what I want you to notice is that the way he describes them, the pattern is the same. The pattern of the change within the person and how one enters into it is the same, whether or not it's alms, mercy giving, or prayer or fasting. What that means is that he's not talking about the specifics of prayer or the specifics of almsgiving. What he's actually doing here is giving us a general account. He's saying, here's the general features of how a discipline affects change within a person. Okay? And that repetition tells us that these are general features. They're not unique to one discipline over another. They're common to all the disciplines. And part of what that means is we can expect the same kind of pattern to show up, for instance, in practice of solitude, right? Or in a practice of intentional vulnerability or something like that, as we do in these. He's describing the general features of a discipline as a discipline, okay? Did that make sense? Yeah? Okay. All right. So if we could, somebody read for us Matthew chapter 6, first verses 1 through 5. Yeah. And then, 1 through 6. I didn't do it right when I wrote it here. 1 through 6 and then 16 through 18. Okay.
Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you.
And then 16 through 18.
When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen. And your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you.
Okay. So you guys saw the pattern there, right? In all of these, it's first of all, we, in order to do this well, we do it in secret. Okay? And we do that because it's going to have something to do with what the wage or reward is, what the payment is that comes out of it. We're going to have to talk about that. And the payment depends on, changes depending on if we're doing it before men or before others, right? Okay, so in order to understand what's going on here, we have to ask the question. So the term that's used, it gets translated reward, but it's misphos. It's the word, it's a wage, right? What is the wage? Okay, what's this wage that he's talking about? And in order to answer that, you have to notice that the wage is tied in Jesus' description here to intention. Okay? To the intention of the act. Why are you doing what you're doing? And another way to say that is before whom, in the presence of whom, are you doing it? And so your intention here is like, it's not just do people happen to be around, but who are you doing this to be seen by? Right? That's a different thing. That's a level of intention. Okay? Now, in terms of kind of the layers of the self that we've talked about, intention is a heart thing, right? So this is about using our, like, what are we focused on as we enter into these regular practices. Okay? And it turns out that we can do this in one of two ways. But we can't do it both ways at once. Okay? We can do it either in such a way that it's secret before men and present before the Father. Okay? In other words, we're in our heart, in our mind, in our range of awareness. The one thing that we're doing in this practice is we're interacting with God. We're coming before the Father in this. Or we can do it in order to be noticed by human beings. Okay? And so what you have here is a kind of a contrast between what I'm going to call an intrinsic and an extrinsic reward. Now, intrinsic and extrinsic, these words, I know they may not be familiar. Intrinsic just means it's built into the practice itself. That the reward comes out of the practice itself. Okay? I'm sorry, let me say one more word here. A wage is obviously some kind of a benefit. So let me just say, when you have this word wage, let's just start by, it would help if we just say, what is the benefit that comes out of doing a regular practice of fasting at a certain time, praying at a certain time, something like that, right? What is the benefit? Okay? And that benefit that comes to the person could either be something that's built in to the practice itself, or it could be something unrelated that you get later, or that you get from outside because of it. And essentially what Jesus does here is he says, you have to choose one or the other, because which wage you get, what benefit you get, depends on your intention. It depends on who you're doing it in the presence of. If you do it before men, what you're going to get is this reward from the outside. And the reward will be very precisely the fact that they saw you do it. The reward that you will get, in this case, will be reputation. Right? And the benefits that come from that in your social setting. Right? And so it's possible to take on any practice, any of them, right? Even solitude you can do in order for people to notice that you did it. And that's a weird thing about the way human beings are put together, but we can do that, right? So any discipline at all, any spiritual discipline can be done for the sake of external add-on rewards that we would get because people are noticing it, okay? And, part of what's going on here is there's just this really strange quirk in human life, like since Adam and Eve, that it's something like this. If we put it into words, it would be something like this. I want to be a good person. But more than I want to be a good person, I want to be thought of as being a good person. Right? And it's that little fissure, that little division between caring to really be and wanting to appear that begins to twist all kinds of things in human life. And so Jesus, he explains how to break out of that, and it's built in to the right use of these disciplines, okay? And so if I do it before human beings in order to be noticed, then what I'll get out of it is the reputation and the benefits that come from human beings. And that'll be the end of it. Okay? But if I do it before the Father alone, okay, then there's going to be a different kind of benefit that comes. And I want you to at least entertain the thought with me, okay, that the benefit that comes when we do this before the Father alone is something that's kind of built into the practice itself. It comes up within it. It's not something that gets added on from outside. It's something that occurs in secret. It's within that practice itself. So Jesus says that when we fast or give, that we should do it in secret, and as it were, place our focus just on the Father. And I think the intrinsic benefit, what he's talking about is this, that these practices, when we engage with them only for the purpose of interacting with God and taking care of our neighbor, right? Only for that, not to be seen or anything, only for that, they have a built-in capacity to draw us deeper into the life of God, deeper into this life of co-working with Him. We begin to see how God does things. We begin to notice more opportunities to participate in that. We begin to understand more about God's own character in the process of that. It's built in. It comes out of the practices themselves when we do them with the chosen intention of being before the Father alone. Okay? With that audience. Okay? So far so good? Now, verses 3 and 4, what Jesus does then is he says, okay, even when we're doing it with the right intention, so that there's this intrinsic benefit that's going to come from life lived out before the Father, there are still degrees of progress. And I just realized I skipped over this whole section here, but we'll loop back to it now, okay? So the middle section there on the handout, section 2, part of what Jesus is going to do here is he's going to describe where the deepest level of benefit comes within a practice. And what he's kind of leaning on here is this picture of how the disciplines change people, that I like to call it a principle of progression. Okay? And the principle of progression is just this. Anything that I do repeatedly becomes easier to do. Okay? And that's for good or ill. Like if it's sitting on the couch eating potato chips and watching trashy movies, if I do that repeatedly, it becomes automatic and easy for me to do. Right? It also becomes, if I, on the other hand, return blessing for cursing, okay, and I do that over time, that becomes easier and easier to do. Okay? It's just anything we do repeatedly becomes easier. Now, much of human life is a process of transferring skills and actions from our heart or mind into our body or soul, we could say, into that unconscious habitual layer. And it happens through this principle of progress. Okay? I'll just give you an example or two. When you first learn how to play a musical instrument, or to engage in a sport, it requires a lot of focus, right? That's a heart heavy in biblical terms, right? You have to be really conscious. You have to put a lot of mental effort and focus into where your hands are if you're playing an instrument, or how you're moving down the court, or dribbling a ball, the hand placement. Now, when you start, you have to think about it a lot, but you also suck at it. Okay? As long as you're having to think about it, you're not doing it well. But what happens is, over time, what that gets kind of translated into body memory and into the habitual level. And at the point where you don't have to think about it, that's the point at which you can actually do it well. Okay? I'm told, I'm not a pianist, but I'm told that the one thing that will actually destroy a performance is if the pianist becomes aware of his or her hands. Okay? Because a good pianist, it's all automatic, and they can just think about the music, and their body is doing it automatically. But if in the midst of a concert they shift and they start noticing their fingers, it's over. Because now they're thinking what ought to be automatic. Okay? Now, what Jesus says here is, verse 3 and 4, he describes the deepest level of benefit happening at the point at which it becomes unconscious. And the way he says that is this, okay? But you, when you give alms, when you give your aid, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Okay? Not your left hand not knowing what your right hand is doing is a beautiful way of describing what we would call habituation. Okay, it's what happens when if you're playing an instrument and you have to think about it still. You're very aware of where both your hands are, but at the point at where it's fully habitual, one can move this way and the other can move that, and they're not they don't have to consult with each other, right? Because it's in the nervous system now. It's in the nervous system. And what Jesus says here is, the greatest level of benefit comes in any of these disciplines, any of these practices, at the point where it becomes just so automatic I don't have to think about it anymore. My right hand doesn't know what my left hand's doing, right? And at that point, what happens is there's a kind of self-forgetfulness that takes place in these deeds. And that's where the deepest benefit comes from. He says, at that point, the Father is seeing and the Father is rewarding in secret. Okay? Now, I'll just point out, as you read through Matthew, this notion of the reward comes back. And it's interesting, you get to chapter 25, the second half, and you have this division of the nations, sheep and goats. And he tells some, those on his right, he said, "Come, you who are blessed of the Father, because you did all these things. Remember, I was hungry and you fed me. I was in prison and you visited me. I was naked and you clothed me." And you remember what they say? What? Huh? I don't remember that. Why? Because they were doing these things so frequently, so regularly, that it was habitual. There wasn't, they did this kind of thing all the time. That occasion wouldn't come to their mind because it was just automatic at that point. Right? And Jesus says that's where the deepest benefit is. That's where blessedness, right? That's where blessedness is. It's where we've engaged in these practices to the degree where they're just now, they're at that unconscious level. They're happening without us choosing anymore because we've been doing it. All I'm really aware of is I've been before the Father. Okay? And the details will fade. But what matters is I'm before the Father, and whoever's around me, that whatever was in need, it's been met. Right? That's where the deepest level of benefit is. Now, have you ever wondered what God gets out of service? when we talk about this kind of intrinsic reward that comes, I said that I think these practices give us a way, if we do them with our focus only on interacting with God and loving neighbor, right? That they have a built-in capacity to draw us further into God's character, His way of doing things. It's worth reflecting. Like, we're told that because Jesus is in the form of God, He doesn't think of that as something to use for Himself, but He takes the form of a servant, right? And when we look at the way that the Creator works, that the Father, He comes with gentleness and humility and constant care for others. God is a servant, okay?
Yes.
So what does God get out of serving? I mean, there's not some being higher than Him that could give Him a reward for it that's extrinsic, right? There's nobody that He needs to satisfy to get an external benefit from. So what is it that God gets out of serving human beings? Let me just say this. If you enter into service in secret, then you will know. And I'll leave it there. You'll know because you'll get the same thing out of it that God does.